In the shadowed corridors of power, where whispered secrets can topple kingdoms and a single moment of courage can change the course of history, one man's unwavering loyalty would be tested beyond imagination. Captain James Morrison had sworn an oath to protect his king with his life, but he never imagined that the greatest threat would come not from enemy armies or assassins in the night, but from within the very walls he had dedicated his life to guard. This is the story of a man who chose truth over comfort, duty over silence, and discovered that sometimes the most dangerous enemy wears a crown of friendship. The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Ravensholm Palace like secrets that refused to be spoken. Captain James Morrison adjusted his ceremonial sword as he walked the familiar corridors, his polished boots echoing against marble floors that had witnessed centuries of royal intrigue. At 42, James had served the crown for nearly 2 decades, rising through the ranks from a simple palace guard to the most trusted protector of King Edward VII of Aldridge. The Kingdom of Aldridge had known peace for the better part of King Edward's 15-year reign, but James had learned that peace within palace walls was often more fragile than any battlefield truce. His keen eyes, trained to spot danger in every shadow, had begun to notice subtle changes in the daily rhythms of court life, changes that made his warrior's instincts whisper warnings he couldn't yet understand. King Edward was a man of simple pleasures despite his royal birth. He preferred morning walks in the palace gardens to elaborate ceremonies, enjoyed lengthy discussions about agriculture with his advisors, rather than grand military parades, and had a genuine smile for every servant who crossed his path. James had always admired these qualities in his monarch, seeing them as signs of strength rather than weakness. A king who cared for his people's well-being was a king worth protecting. But lately, something had shifted in the king's demeanor. Edward seemed distracted during their morning briefings, his usually sharp mind wandering to places James couldn't follow. The king's wife, Queen Victoria, had been spending increasing amounts of time in her private chambers, citing mysterious ailments that the royal physician couldn't quite diagnose. Their marriage, once a beacon of stability in the kingdom, now felt like a ship slowly taking on water. It was during one of these troubled mornings that James first encountered Lady Catherine Blackwood, in a context that would forever change his understanding of palace politics. Lady Catherine had arrived at court 6 months earlier as a distant relative of the royal family, claiming her rightful place among the nobility after years of living abroad. She was undeniably beautiful, with striking auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets. But James had initially paid her little attention beyond ensuring her safety during royal functions. That changed when he discovered her in the king's private study at dawn, long before Edward typically began his day. James had arrived early to review security arrangements for a state dinner, when he heard voices coming from behind the heavy oak doors of the king's personal sanctuary. The study was off-limits to everyone except Edward himself and a handful of his most trusted advisors, and even they required explicit permission to enter. James approached carefully, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. Through a crack in the door that hadn't been properly closed, he could see Lady Catherine seated at the king's personal desk, rifling through private documents with practiced efficiency. Her elegant court dress had been replaced by dark, practical clothing that allowed her to move silently through the shadows. This was not the languid noblewoman who graced the court with her presence during daylight hours. James watched in stunned silence as she photographed several documents with a small, advanced camera, hidden in what appeared to be an ornate jewelry box. The documents she was copying included correspondence between King Edward and his military advisors, financial records detailing the kingdom's treasury reserves, and most troubling of all, detailed maps showing the locations of Aldridge's border fortifications. The realization hit James like a physical blow. Lady Catherine was a spy. But for whom was she gathering this information? And how long had she been operating within the palace walls? James remained motionless, knowing that revealing himself now would destroy any chance of uncovering the full extent of her treachery. He needed to understand the complete picture before taking action that could potentially destabilize the entire kingdom. As Lady Catherine finished her work and prepared to leave, James noticed something that made his blood run cold. She paused at a portrait of King Edward and Queen Victoria, studying it with an expression that was neither admiration nor casual interest. It was the calculating gaze of someone planning something far more sinister than simple espionage. James retreated to his quarters to think. His mind raced through the implications of what he had witnessed. If Lady Catherine was indeed a foreign agent, her access to the royal family made her incredibly dangerous. But if she was working for domestic enemies of the crown, the threat could be even greater. Palace coups had torn apart kingdoms throughout history, and Aldridge was not immune to such machinations. Over the following days, James began to observe Lady Catherine with the same intensity he had once reserved for protecting the king from external threats. He noticed patterns in her behavior that he had previously dismissed as aristocratic eccentricity. She had an uncanny ability to appear wherever sensitive conversations were taking place, always with a plausible reason for being there. She asked seemingly innocent questions about palace security that, when taken together, painted a comprehensive picture of the royal family's vulnerabilities. Most disturbing of all, James began to see how Lady Catherine was systematically isolating King Edward from his traditional sources of counsel and support. The Queen's mysterious illnesses had begun shortly after Lady Catherine's arrival. James started to suspect that Victoria's symptoms might not be entirely natural. The King's closest advisors found themselves excluded from important meetings, replaced by newer faces who deferred to Lady Catherine's subtle suggestions. Even the palace staff, who had served the royal family loyally for decades, were being gradually replaced by individuals who had been recommended by Lady Catherine herself. James realized that he was witnessing a masterpiece of manipulation, executed with patience and precision over many months. Lady Catherine wasn't just gathering intelligence, she was positioning herself to control the kingdom from within. The turning point came during a private dinner between King Edward and Lady Catherine that James was assigned to guard. Hidden behind a tapestry in the dining room, he listened to their conversation with growing alarm. Lady Catherine spoke in soft, caring tones about the kingdom's challenges, gradually steering the discussion towards solutions that would dramatically increase her own influence, while weakening the traditional power structures that had kept Aldridge stable for generations. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice filled with apparent concern, "perhaps it's time to consider that some of your current advisors may not have your best interests at heart. I've heard whispers about their loyalty, and I fear they may be working against you." King Edward, who had grown increasingly paranoid due to his isolation from trusted counsel, listened intently. "What kind of whispers, Catherine?" "I hesitate to speak of such things, but I've overheard conversations suggesting that some members of your inner circle may be in communication with foreign powers. I have no proof, of course, but their recent advice has seemed designed to weaken your position rather than strengthen it." James watched through a gap in the tapestry as Lady Catherine placed her hand gently on the king's arm, her touch conveying both comfort and intimacy. The gesture was subtle but unmistakably romantic, and James realized with horror that Lady Catherine was seducing the king as part of her broader strategy. "I know this is difficult to hear," she continued, "but I believe you need someone you can truly trust by your side. Someone who understands the delicate nature of royal politics and has only your welfare at heart." King Edward looked at Lady Catherine with an expression that combined gratitude, attraction, and dangerous vulnerability.
"I felt so alone lately, Catherine."
"Victoria has been ill, my advisors seem distant, and I sometimes wonder if anyone truly understands the burden of leadership. You're not alone, Your Majesty. I'm here, and I will always be here for you." James felt sick as he watched the scene unfold. Lady Catherine was expertly exploiting the king's emotional vulnerability, using his loneliness and confusion to manipulate him toward decisions that would ultimately serve her mysterious agenda. The Queen's illness, the advisor's apparent distance, even the king's growing sense of isolation. James now suspected that all of these factors had been carefully orchestrated by Lady Catherine herself. But the most chilling moment came at the end of their dinner, when Lady Catherine made a suggestion that revealed the true scope of her ambitions. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've been thinking about the succession question. I know it's a delicate topic, but given the Queen's ongoing health concerns and the uncertainty it creates for the kingdom's future, perhaps it's time to consider alternative arrangements." King Edward frowned. "Alternative arrangements? What do you mean?" "I mean that strong kingdoms require strong leaders who are supported by equally strong partners. If the Queen is unable to fulfill her duties due to her illness, it might be necessary to make difficult decisions for the good of Aldridge." The implication was clear, even if the words weren't spoken directly. Lady Catherine was suggesting that King Edward should set aside Queen Victoria and marry her instead. James had heard enough. He now understood that Lady Catherine wasn't just a spy or a manipulator seeking political influence. She was orchestrating a complete takeover of the kingdom, using seduction, isolation, and carefully planned manipulation to position herself as the power behind the throne, and eventually as Queen herself. The question that tormented James as he returned to his quarters that night was not whether to act, but how to act without triggering a crisis that could destroy the kingdom he had sworn to protect. Lady Catherine had been extraordinarily careful in her approach, never doing anything that could be easily proven as treason. Her suggestions were always phrased as loyal concern. Her actions could always be explained as aristocratic privilege, and her growing influence over the king appeared to be the result of natural romantic attraction, rather than calculated manipulation. If James moved too quickly or without sufficient evidence, Lady Catherine could easily paint him as a paranoid guard who was inventing conspiracies to justify his own importance. Worse still, if King Edward had already fallen completely under her influence, James might find himself branded as a traitor for opposing the woman the king was beginning to trust above all others. But if he waited too long, Lady Catherine might succeed in her ultimate goal, leaving Aldridge under the control of someone whose true loyalties remained completely unknown. James spent sleepless hours walking the palace corridors, weighing his options and considering the consequences of each possible course of action. His oath was to protect the king, but what happened when the greatest threat to the king's well-being came from someone the king himself trusted implicitly? As dawn broke over Ravensholm Palace, James made his decision. He would gather irrefutable proof of Lady Catherine's treachery, even if it meant risking his own life and career. The kingdom's survival depended on exposing the truth before it was too late to act. He had no idea that Lady Catherine had been watching him just as carefully as he had been watching her, or that she had already begun planning his elimination as a potential threat to her carefully constructed plans. The game between the loyal guard and the scheming courtier was about to begin in earnest, with the fate of an entire kingdom hanging in the balance. Captain James Morrison knew that gathering evidence against Lady Catherine would require patience, cunning, and resources he didn't officially possess. His position as head of the Royal Guard gave him access to most areas of the palace, but it also made him highly visible to anyone who might be watching for signs of suspicion. He needed allies he could trust absolutely, and in a court where Lady Catherine's influence was growing daily, such allies were becoming increasingly rare. His first move was to approach Master Thomas Whitfield, the palace librarian and keeper of royal records. Thomas had served the crown for over 30 years and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of court history and protocol. More importantly, he was one of the few people in the palace who seemed immune to Lady Catherine's charm, viewing her with the polite but distant courtesy he reserved for all newcomers until they had proven their worth over time. James found Thomas in his usual habitat, surrounded by towering shelves of ancient books and documents in the palace library's restricted section. The elderly librarian looked up from a manuscript he was cataloguing, his wire-rimmed spectacles reflecting the lamplight. "Captain Morrison," Thomas said with genuine warmth, "how may I assist you today? Surely not with research into military tactics again?" James glanced around to ensure they were alone before speaking in low tones. "Thomas, I need your help with something sensitive. It concerns Lady Catherine Blackwood and her family history." Thomas raised an eyebrow but nodded for James to continue. "I need to know everything about her background, her family connections, and most importantly, how she came to be accepted at court so readily. Something doesn't feel right about her presence here." The librarian studied James for a long moment, as if weighing the implications of his request. Finally, he set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "You know, Captain, I've been wondering about Lady Catherine myself. When she first arrived and presented her credentials, something struck me as unusual. Her documentation was all perfectly legal and properly authenticated, but it felt too perfect, if you understand my meaning." James felt a surge of relief. His instincts about Thomas had been correct. "I've maintained detailed records of all noble families associated with the crown for decades," Thomas continued. "The Blackwood lineage she claims is real enough, but there are gaps in the family history that don't quite align with the story she's presented. Give me a few days to conduct some discreet inquiries through my network of fellow historians and record keepers in other kingdoms." While Thomas began his research, James turned his attention to understanding Lady Catherine's daily routines and the network of people she was building within the palace. He assigned his most trusted guards to discreet surveillance duties, creating a careful rotation that would allow them to monitor her movements without establishing patterns that might be detected. What they discovered over the next week was deeply troubling. Lady Catherine maintained correspondence with individuals outside the kingdom through a sophisticated network of messengers who never used the official royal postal service. She received regular packages that were delivered to her private chambers without passing through the normal security protocols that governed all other deliveries to the palace. Most concerning of all, several of the new staff members she had recommended were asking detailed questions about palace security procedures, the king's daily schedule, and the locations of various strategic resources within the royal complex. James also noticed that Lady Catherine had begun hosting intimate dinner parties in her private quarters, inviting carefully selected combinations of nobles, advisors, and wealthy merchants who had previously had limited influence at court. These gatherings were presented as social occasions, but James suspected they served as recruitment meetings for building a coalition of supporters who could be called upon when Lady Catherine made her ultimate move for power. The breakthrough in Thomas's research came exactly 1 week after James had made his initial request. The librarian appeared at James's quarters late one evening, carrying a leather satchel filled with documents and wearing an expression that mixed excitement with grave concern. "James," he said without preamble, "you are absolutely right to be suspicious. Lady Catherine Blackwood is not who she claims to be." Thomas spread several documents across James's desk, pointing to discrepancies and connections that painted a picture of elaborate deception. "The real Lady Catherine Blackwood died of fever in the Kingdom of Westmarch 3 years ago," Thomas explained. "She was indeed a distant relative of our royal family, but she lived quietly on a small estate and had no interest in court life. The woman who has been living among us has assumed her identity with remarkable attention to detail." "Then who is she really?" James asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Her real name appears to be Elena Vasquez, and she's connected to the Crimson Hand." James felt his blood turn cold. The Crimson Hand was a secretive organization that specialized in political destabilization and regime change throughout the continental kingdoms. They were rumored to be responsible for at least 3 successful coups in neighboring countries over the past decade, always working through elaborate long-term infiltration rather than direct military action. "According to my sources," Thomas continued, "Elena Vasquez is one of their most skilled operatives. She's been trained in everything from advanced espionage techniques to court etiquette, languages, and even romantic manipulation. Her specialty is embedding herself within royal courts and working from the inside to either control or eliminate existing rulers."
The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together in James's mind.
The Queen's mysterious illness, the King's growing isolation from his advisors, the gradual replacement of loyal staff members, it's all been orchestrated to weaken the existing power structure and create a vacuum that she can fill. "Exactly," Thomas agreed. "But here's the most alarming part. According to my research, the Crimson Hand doesn't work for personal gain. They're always employed by someone else, typically a foreign power, that wants to gain control over a target kingdom, without the expense and uncertainty of military conquest. Do we know who's paying them this time?" Thomas shook his head grimly. "That information is closely guarded, but based on the timeline and some coded references in intercepted communications, I suspect it's either the Empire of Moravian to our east, who would benefit greatly from access to our trade routes, or the Northern Federation, who has been eyeing our mineral resources for years." James realized that the threat facing Aldridge was far greater than a simple palace coup. They were dealing with a foreign invasion executed through subterfuge rather than warfare, and Elena Vasquez, the woman they knew as Lady Catherine, was the advance force of that invasion. "We need to inform the king immediately," James said, but Thomas grabbed his arm. "Think carefully about that, my friend. You said yourself that King Edward has fallen under her influence. If we present this evidence to him now, she's likely to convince him that we're the ones who can't be trusted. She's had months to poison his mind against his traditional advisors and supporters." James knew Thomas was right, but the implications were terrifying. "Then what do you suggest?" "We can't simply stand by and watch her complete her takeover. We need more evidence, and we need to present it in a way that even an infatuated king cannot dismiss." "What about the foreign agent who's been asking questions about our operations?" the stranger asked. "Someone has been making inquiries through various channels about your background and activities. Our contacts in the intelligence community report unusual interest in the Crimson Hand's current operations. It's possible that a rival kingdom has become aware of our mission and is working to interfere." James realized with growing excitement that help might be coming from an unexpected source. If another foreign power had learned about Elena's operation and was working to expose it, that could provide the additional evidence and credibility his coalition needed to convince King Edward of the truth. But it also meant that multiple foreign powers were now treating Aldridge as a battlefield for their competing interests, with the kingdom's own people caught in the middle. "Double the security measures," Elena ordered. "I want to know about anyone who gets within a mile of this palace without proper authorization. And accelerate our timeline for the Queen's final accident. I want her dead within the week." James had heard enough. As soon as the stranger departed through whatever secret route he had used to enter the palace, James hurried to find Thomas and Sir Robert. The time for careful investigation and gradual evidence gathering had passed. If they didn't act immediately, Queen Victoria would be murdered, and Elena would consolidate her position as the power behind the throne. The final confrontation was about to begin, but James still wasn't sure they had enough support to overcome Elena's carefully constructed network of allies and foreign backing. The next few days would determine not only the fate of the royal family, but the future independence of the entire kingdom of Aldridge. As James prepared for what might be the most important battle of his career, he couldn't shake the feeling that Elena was also preparing for their confrontation, and that she held advantages he hadn't yet discovered. The emergency meeting took place in the ancient chapel beneath Ravensholm Palace, a location chosen because Elena's network of informants would be unlikely to monitor religious activities. James arrived first, followed by Thomas and Sir Robert, and finally by 3 other individuals they had carefully recruited over the past week. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the Queen's longtime companion, Dr. Edmund Hayes, the royal physician who had been growing increasingly concerned about the Queen's mysterious symptoms, and Commander William Drake, head of the palace's external security forces. "Thank you all for coming," James began, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "What I'm about to share with you may be difficult to believe, but the evidence is overwhelming. Our kingdom is under attack from within, and we have very little time to prevent a catastrophic takeover." He proceeded to lay out everything they had discovered about Elena Vasquez's true identity, her connections to the Crimson Hand, and her systematic campaign to eliminate or control the royal family. Thomas provided historical context and documentation, while Sir Robert explained the military implications of having foreign agents embedded within the palace's security structure. Lady Margaret was the first to speak when James finished his presentation. "This explains so much about Her Majesty's condition," she said, her voice tight with anger. "I've been caring for Queen Victoria for over 15 years, and I've never seen anything like her current symptoms. They don't match any natural illness, but they're completely consistent with gradual poisoning." "Doctor." Hayes nodded grimly. "I've suspected the same thing, but I couldn't identify the specific agent being used. If Lady Catherine has access to advanced toxins from foreign sources, it would explain why traditional treatments have been ineffective." Commander Drake leaned forward intently. "Captain Morrison, you mentioned evidence of a broader network within the palace. How extensive is their infiltration?" James consulted his notes. "We've identified at least 12 staff members who were hired on Elena's recommendation, and are now in positions that give them access to sensitive information, or the ability to move freely throughout the palace. There are probably others we haven't discovered yet. Then we're looking at a coordinated cell operation with multiple agents working in support of Elena's primary mission," Sir Robert observed. "This is much more sophisticated than a simple assassination or coup attempt." The gravity of their situation was becoming clear to everyone present. They weren't dealing with a single rogue agent, but with a comprehensive intelligence operation that had been years in the planning and execution. "What's our immediate priority?" Lady Margaret asked. "We need to save Queen Victoria's life and expose Elena's true identity to King Edward before she can eliminate either of us," James replied. "But we also need to be prepared for the possibility that Elena has contingency plans we haven't discovered." Dr. Hayes stood up. "I can begin treating the Queen immediately if you can provide me with protection from Elena's network. I'll need to conduct blood tests and begin administering antidotes for the most common political poisons used by organizations like the Crimson Hand. I can provide discreet medical security," Commander Drake offered. "My external guards haven't been compromised because they operate independently of the internal palace staff that Elena has been manipulating." Thomas cleared his throat. "There's something else we need to consider. The foreign agent who's been investigating Elena's activities contacted me yesterday through coded message. He wants to meet." James felt a surge of both hope and caution. "What did he say?" "Only that he represents interests that are opposed to Elena's employers, and that he has information that could help us. He's requested a meeting tomorrow night." Sir Robert frowned. "It could be a trap. If Elena has discovered our investigation, she might be using a fake foreign agent to lure us into a vulnerable position." "Possible," Thomas agreed. "But the authentication codes he used are consistent with legitimate intelligence operations from the Kingdom of Westmarch. They have reasons to oppose the same foreign powers that are backing Elena." James weighed the risks. Meeting with an unknown foreign agent was dangerous, but they needed all the help they could get, and the information such a contact might provide could be crucial to stopping Elena's operation. "We'll meet with him," James decided, "but under carefully controlled conditions, with full security backup." As the group prepared to disperse and begin their respective missions, Lady Margaret placed a gentle hand on James's arm. "Captain, there's something else you should know about the Queen's condition. In her lucid moments, she's been trying to warn me about Lady Catherine. She suspects something is wrong, but hasn't been able to articulate it clearly due to the poisoning. If we can partially counteract the toxins, she might be able to provide additional evidence about what she's observed." This news filled James with renewed determination. Queen Victoria had always been an intelligent and perceptive woman, If she had noticed Elena's deception despite being systematically poisoned, her testimony could be exactly what they needed to convince King Edward of the truth. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of carefully coordinated activity. Hayes began discreetly treating Queen Victoria with general antidotes while conducting tests to identify the specific poison being used. Commander Drake positioned his most trusted guards in strategic locations throughout the palace. Sir Robert reached out to military contacts outside the palace to assess their readiness to respond if the situation escalated to open conflict. Meanwhile, James maintained his normal duties, while keeping Elena under discreet surveillance. He was alarmed to discover that she had requested a private dinner with King Edward for the following evening, the same night as the planned meeting with the mysterious foreign agent. The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. That evening, James made his way to the designated meeting location, an abandoned watchtower on the palace grounds that provided clear sightlines in all directions and multiple escape routes if needed. He brought 2 of his most trusted guards and positioned Commander Drake's men at strategic points around the area. The foreign agent arrived exactly on time, approaching alone and with his hands clearly visible. He was a man of average height and build, probably in his 40s, with the kind of unremarkable appearance that would allow him to blend into crowds easily. He identified himself only as Marcus and provided the authentication codes Thomas had mentioned. "Captain Morrison," Marcus said without preamble, "I represent interests that are deeply concerned about Elena Vasquez's mission in your kingdom. We believe she's working for the Moravian Empire, and her success here would threaten the balance of power throughout the entire region. What can you tell us about her operation?" James asked. Marcus pulled out a small portfolio containing documents and photographs. "Elena is one of the Crimson Hand's most successful operatives, but she's never worked on a mission of this complexity before. Usually, their operations focus on eliminating existing rulers and installing more controllable replacements. This time, they're attempting to maintain the appearance of legitimacy while fundamentally changing the kingdom's allegiances." He showed James detailed intelligence reports about Elena's background, training, and previous operations. The information confirmed and expanded upon what Thomas had discovered through his own research. The Moravian Empire wants access to Aldridge's strategic location and resources, but they also want to avoid the international complications that would arise from direct military conquest. Marcus continued. "If Elena succeeds in marrying King Edward and eliminating Queen Victoria, she'll be positioned to gradually align your kingdom's policies with Moravian interests while maintaining the fiction of Aldridge's independence." "How long do we have?" James asked. "Not long. Our sources indicate that Elena has received orders to accelerate her timeline dramatically. The Moravian Empire is facing internal pressures that make them eager to secure Aldridge's resources as quickly as possible." Marcus handed James a small device that looked like an ornate fountain pen. "This contains a powerful sedative that will incapacitate Elena within minutes if administered properly. It's designed to be undetectable in food or drink and will make her appear to be suffering from a sudden illness rather than being drugged." James accepted the device but remained cautious. "Why are you helping us? What does your government gain from preventing Elena's success?" "Stability," Marcus replied simply. "A Moravian-controlled Aldridge would threaten our own borders and trade relationships. We have no desire to control your kingdom ourselves. We simply want to prevent our enemies from doing so." As Marcus prepared to leave, he provided one final piece of crucial information. "Be aware that Elena has contingency plans if her primary mission fails. She's been in communication with Moravian military commanders about the possibility of creating a crisis that would justify direct intervention. If she can't take control through marriage and political manipulation, she might attempt to trigger a conflict that would give the Moravians an excuse to invade Aldridge as peacekeepers." After Marcus departed, James hurried back to the palace to share this intelligence with his allies. The information confirmed his worst fears about the scope of the threat they were facing, but it also provided them with tools and strategies they could use to fight back. Dr. Prawl. Hayes had made significant progress in treating Queen Victoria. The antidotes were beginning to clear the toxins from her system, and she was experiencing longer periods of mental clarity. During one of these lucid moments, she provided crucial testimony about what she had observed during her illness. "James," she whispered when he visited her chambers, "that woman is not what she appears to be. I've seen her going through Edward's private papers, and I've heard her speaking in languages I don't recognize. There's something in her eyes when she thinks no one is watching. A coldness that has nothing to do with love or loyalty. Your Majesty, we know who she really is, and we're working to expose her before she can harm you or the king. But we need you to get stronger so you can help us convince His Majesty of the truth." Queen Victoria gripped his hand with surprising strength. Do whatever you must to protect the kingdom, James. Edward may be angry with you at first, but his duty to Aldridge will ultimately overcome any personal feelings. As James left the Queen's chambers, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Tomorrow evening, during Elena's private dinner with King Edward, they would make their move. Everything they had worked for, everything they believed about loyalty and duty, would be tested in a confrontation that would determine the future of the kingdom. But Elena was also preparing for tomorrow night, and James couldn't shake the feeling that she had been planning for this confrontation just as carefully as they had been preparing to expose her. The battle for Aldridge's independence was about to reach its climax, and only one side could emerge victorious. As James walked the familiar corridors of Ravensholm Palace, he wondered if tomorrow night would be the last time he would make these rounds as captain of the Royal Guard, or if it might be the last time anyone would make them as a free citizen of an independent kingdom. The day of reckoning arrived with deceptive tranquility. Morning sunlight filtered through the palace windows as if nothing had changed, but James could feel the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Every member of their coalition was in position, every contingency had been planned, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Elena was equally prepared for what was to come. Queen Victoria's recovery had accelerated overnight. Dr. Hayes reported that the antidotes were working more effectively than expected, clearing enough of the toxins from her system to restore much of her mental clarity and physical strength. She was weak but determined, insisting on playing an active role in exposing the woman who had tried to murder her. I want to confront her directly, Victoria told James during their final planning meeting. Edward needs to see the contrast between my genuine concern for the kingdom and her calculated manipulation. Sometimes the most powerful evidence is simply the truth spoken by someone who has no reason to lie. Sir Robert had positioned loyal guards throughout the palace, replacing Elena's infiltrators with men whose loyalty to the crown had been tested over years of faithful service. Commander Drake's external security forces were ready to seal the palace if Elena attempted to escape or call in foreign backup. Thomas had prepared comprehensive documentation of Elena's true identity and connections to the Crimson Hand, organized in a way that even an emotionally compromised king would find difficult to dismiss. Lady Margaret stood ready to provide testimony about the Queen's systematic poisoning and her observations of Elena's suspicious behavior. As evening approached, James felt the familiar calm that came before decisive action. He had experienced this feeling on battlefields, during palace emergencies, and in moments when everything he valued hung in the balance. Tonight would be the culmination of his 20 years of service to the crown. Elena appeared for her dinner with King Edward dressed in an elegant emerald gown that emphasized her striking appearance. James watched from his concealed position as she greeted the king with what appeared to be genuine affection, but which he now recognized as masterful acting. Every smile, every gentle touch, every concerned glance had been calculated to manipulate Edward's emotions and cloud his judgment. The dinner began normally, with Elena maintaining her usual role as a caring confidant offering comfort to a troubled monarch. But James noticed subtle signs that she was preparing for something significant. She had positioned herself with clear sightlines to all entrances and exits. Her posture was more alert than usual despite her relaxed appearance, and she kept glancing at a small ornate clock on the mantelpiece as if timing something specific. Edward, she said as the meal neared its end, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the succession question. Given Victoria's continued decline, I believe it's time to take more decisive action. King Edward looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Despite months of manipulation, his fundamental decency was reasserting itself as the immediate emotional crisis of his wife's illness began to stabilize. Catherine, I appreciate your concern, but Victoria seems to be improving. Dr. Hayes believes she may make a full recovery. Elena's expression flickered for just a moment, revealing a flash of irritation that she quickly concealed behind renewed concern. I hope you're right, of course, but we must be realistic about the kingdom's needs. Aldridge requires strong leadership, and if Victoria cannot fulfill her duties as queen, perhaps it would be kinder to everyone involved to make alternative arrangements. This was the moment James had been waiting for. Elena was pushing too hard, too fast, allowing her desperation to overcome her usual patience and subtlety. It was time to act. James stepped out of concealment, followed by Sir Robert and Thomas.
Elena's eyes widened slightly at their appearance, but she quickly composed herself.
Your Majesty, James said formally. I apologize for interrupting your dinner, but we have urgent information that requires your immediate attention. King Edward looked confused and somewhat annoyed.
Captain Morrison, surely this could wait until tomorrow. I'm afraid it cannot, Your Majesty. We have discovered evidence that Lady Catherine is not who she claims to be, and that she represents a direct threat to your safety and the independence of our kingdom. Elena rose gracefully from her chair, her demeanor shifting to one of hurt surprise and dignified indignation. Your Majesty, I'm shocked by these accusations. I can only assume that Captain Morrison has allowed his dedication to security to become paranoia. Perhaps the stress of his duties has affected his judgment. It was a masterful response, James had to admit. Elena was positioning herself as the innocent victim of an overzealous guard's suspicions, while subtly questioning his mental state and professional competence. King Edward looked between James and Elena, clearly torn between his emotional attachment to Catherine and his long-standing trust in his captain of guards. "What evidence?" the king asked finally. Thomas stepped forward and began laying out documents on the dining table. "Your Majesty, the woman you know as Lady Catherine Blackwood is actually Elena Vasquez, an agent of the Crimson Hand working on behalf of the Moravian Empire. The real Lady Catherine Blackwood died 3 years ago, and this woman has assumed her identity as part of a sophisticated operation to gain control of our kingdom." Elena examined the documents with apparent interest before responding calmly. "These are very impressive forgeries, Your Majesty, but I'm afraid they prove nothing except that someone has gone to considerable trouble to create false evidence against me. I can only wonder who would benefit from destroying my reputation and my relationship with you." James realized that Elena had prepared for this moment just as thoroughly as they had. She was systematically undermining their evidence and turning the situation into a question of competing loyalties rather than objective facts. "Perhaps," Elena continued, "we should ask why Captain Morrison has been conducting secret investigations without your knowledge or authorization. What other activities has he been engaged in that he hasn't reported to you?" King Edward's expression was beginning to show doubt about James's motivations, and James knew they were losing the initiative. It was time to deploy their most powerful weapon. "Your Majesty," James said, "there's someone here who can speak to these accusations with absolute authority." He signaled to Lady Margaret, who appeared in the doorway supporting Queen Victoria. The Queen was pale and clearly still recovering from her ordeal, but her eyes were alert and determined. Elena's composed facade cracked for the first time that evening. She had not expected Victoria to be coherent enough to participate in any confrontation, and the Queen's sudden appearance clearly disrupted whatever contingency plans she had prepared. "Victoria!" King Edward rushed to his wife's side, his concern and relief evident. "You should be resting. You're still recovering from your illness." "I'm recovering from being slowly poisoned, Edward," Victoria said clearly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years as queen. "And the woman responsible is standing right there." She pointed directly at Eleanor, who was now calculating her options with visible tension. "This woman has been systematically administering toxins to me for months, while positioning herself as your emotional support during my decline. She's not Lady Catherine Blackwood. She's a foreign agent working to gain control of our kingdom by eliminating me and marrying you." King Edward stared at Elena in shock. "Catherine, tell me this isn't true. Tell me Victoria is still confused from her illness." Elena looked around the room, assessing the faces arrayed against her and the evidence that had been compiled. James could see her weighing her remaining options and coming to the conclusion that her original plan had failed irretrievably. When she spoke again, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the soft, cultured accent of aristocratic breeding, replaced by something sharper and more direct. "Your Majesty," she said, with cold professionalism, "you should understand that your kingdom's fate was sealed the moment I walked through these palace doors. If you cannot be controlled through persuasion, then alternative arrangements will be made." She reached into her evening purse and withdrew a small device that James recognized as a sophisticated communication device. Before anyone could stop her, she activated it and spoke a brief code phrase in a language none of them recognized. "What have you done?" King Edward demanded. "I've signaled for the implementation of our contingency plan. Within the hour, Moravian forces will cross your border under the pretext of responding to reports of civil unrest within your palace. They will arrive as peacekeepers to restore stability and ensure the continuity of government." Sir Robert stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we need to alert our military commanders immediately and prepare our defenses." But Eleanor wasn't finished. "I'm afraid your military response options are quite limited. Several of your key commanders have been receiving information for months suggesting that other officers are planning a coup against you. They've been encouraged to prepare defensive measures that will actually prevent them from coordinating an effective response to external threats." James realized with growing horror that Elena's infiltration of the kingdom had been even more comprehensive than they had discovered. She had been creating confusion and mistrust within the military command structure while simultaneously gathering intelligence and positioning assets for the final takeover. However, Elena continued, there is still a path that could preserve some measure of Aldridge's autonomy. If Your Majesty agrees to marriage in a new treaty arrangement with the Moravian Empire, the incoming forces could be repositioned as protection rather than occupation.
Never,
King Edward said with finality. I would rather die defending Aldridge's independence than live as a puppet ruler serving foreign masters. Elena shrugged elegantly. That can certainly be arranged as well. She reached for another item in her purse, but this time James was ready. He lunged forward and tackled her before she could draw what appeared to be a weapon. They struggled briefly before Sir Robert and Commander Drake helped subdue her. Your Majesty, Commander Drake reported, my external guards have identified unusual military activity near our borders, but our intelligence network suggests it may be less extensive than she claimed. The Moravians appear to have prepared a rapid response force, but it's not large enough for a full occupation without significant preparation time. Thomas looked up from examining Elena's communication device. This appears to be coded to reach multiple recipients. She may have been bluffing about the scope of the immediate threat while signaling for help that could take time to arrive. James felt a surge of hope. If Elena had been exaggerating the immediate danger to create pressure for surrender, they might have time to mount an effective defense. Sir Robert, King Edward commanded, send word to all our military commanders to ignore any previous communications that suggested internal threats and to prepare for potential foreign incursion. I want our forces coordinated and ready within 2 hours. Commander Drake, seal the palace and begin searching for any other foreign agents who may be embedded within our staff. Use whatever methods necessary to identify and neutralize Elena's network. Thomas, send immediate communications to the kingdoms of Westmarch and our other allies, informing them of the Moravian threat and requesting whatever assistance they can provide. As his subordinates hurried to carry out their orders, King Edward approached James with an expression that mixed gratitude, embarrassment, and renewed determination. Captain Morrison, I owe you an apology and the thanks of the entire kingdom. Your loyalty and courage have saved us from a catastrophe that I was too blind to see approaching. Your Majesty, I was only doing my duty to protect you and Queen Victoria. The real credit belongs to everyone who risked their positions and safety to uncover the truth. Queen Victoria, who had been listening to the exchanges with growing strength, stepped forward and placed her hand on James's arm. Captain, you've proven once again why the crown depends on individuals of character and conviction. Without your willingness to stand up and speak difficult truths, our kingdom would have fallen to enemies we never saw coming. Over the following hours, James coordinated the dismantling of Elena's spy network while Sir Robert and Commander Drake organized the kingdom's defenses. They discovered that Elena had been more successful in creating confusion than in positioning actual military assets, and the immediate threat of invasion began to diminish as Aldridge's forces demonstrated their readiness to resist. The Moravian Rapid Response Force that had been positioned near the border withdrew when it became clear that their infiltration operation had failed and that Aldridge was prepared for military conflict. Without Elena's intelligence and internal sabotage, a direct invasion would be far more costly and less likely to succeed. Elena herself was placed under maximum security detention while diplomats worked to negotiate her exchange for captured Aldridge agents who had been arrested in other kingdoms. The Crimson Hand's sophisticated operation had been completely dismantled, and their reputation for invincibility had suffered a significant blow. 3 months later, James stood in the same palace corridors where he had first noticed signs of Elena's infiltration. Queen Victoria had made a complete recovery and had resumed her full duties as queen with renewed vigor and appreciation for her role. King Edward had learned valuable lessons about the dangers of isolation and the importance of maintaining strong relationships with trusted advisors. The Kingdom of Aldridge had emerged from its brush with foreign conquest, stronger and more united than before. The crisis had revealed both vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed and sources of strength that had previously been taken for granted. James received numerous honors and commendations for his role in protecting the kingdom, but the recognition he valued most was the quiet confidence that he had fulfilled his oath to serve and protect the crown with honor and integrity. As he made his evening security rounds, James reflected on the lessons of the past year. Loyalty was not simply about following orders or maintaining traditions. It was about having the courage to act on principle, even when doing so involved personal risk and difficult choices. The palace corridors that had once whispered with secrets and conspiracies now echoed with the sounds of honest governance and open discussion. The Kingdom of Aldridge had survived its greatest test, and James knew that it was better prepared to face whatever challenges the future might bring. Sometimes, he thought as he completed his final security check of the evening, the greatest act of loyalty was the willingness to stand up and speak truth to power. Even when that truth was difficult to hear and dangerous to speak, the loyal guard who had stood up had indeed saved his kingdom, but more importantly, he had proven that individual integrity and moral courage could triumph over even the most sophisticated forms of deception and manipulation. As James locked the final security checkpoint of the night, he felt the deep satisfaction that comes from duty faithfully performed and honor maintained against all odds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities, but tonight, the kingdom of Aldridge slept peacefully under the protection of those who truly understood the meaning of loyal service.